Somewhere in a Russian air defense planning office, deep behind the Ural Mountains, sat a number everyone trusted without needing to check it twice. 1,600 kilometers. That was the accepted maximum range of Ukraine's FP-1 strike drone, the figure written into briefings, the figure that quietly decided which targets needed protecting and which ones did not. Omsk sat well outside that number. Russia's largest oil refinery, more than 2,500 kilometers from the nearest point of Ukrainian territory, processing over 22 million tons of crude a year, close to a tenth of the country's entire refining capacity. By that trusted number, it was untouchable. Nobody in Omsk was losing sleep over drones. That number was already wrong, and had been for weeks. At a defense exhibition months earlier, Firepoint, the Ukrainian manufacturer behind the FP-1, had quietly shown off something different. The same airframe, but with longer, reshaped wings. A trapezoidal design that cut drag and, more importantly, hid something inside itself that the original model never had. Extra fuel volume, built directly into the wing structure rather than bolted on as an afterthought. On paper, it looked like an aerodynamic refinement. In practice, it more than doubled the aircraft's range, pushing it out toward 3,400 kilometers, more than double the number sitting in every Russian planning document. Ukraine let the exhibition photos circulate. It said nothing about what the redesign actually meant. Russian analysts who noticed the new wing shape filed it as a curiosity. Nobody updated the 1,600-kilometer assumption because nobody had a reason to think that number needed updating yet. The mission that would prove them wrong took more than a week of planning before a single drone left the ground. Route selection alone was its own kind of warfare, plotted by planners who understood that a straight line from launch point to target is the fastest way to fly directly into every radar station along the way. The path Ukraine settled on bent and curved deliberately, threading through known gaps in Russia's layered air defense coverage, trading distance for invisibility. None of that knowledge came free. It was built up strike by strike, over months of previous raids against closer targets, each one quietly mapping out the gaps this much longer mission would eventually need. Guidance had to solve a separate problem entirely. A flight lasting the better part of a day, deep into territory saturated with Russian electronic warfare, could not survive on GPS alone. Firepoint built the mission around a custom navigation algorithm, inertial guidance and satellite positioning layered together, designed specifically to keep flying a coherent path even while Russian jamming did everything in its power to convince the drone it was somewhere it was not. The system did not need to be perfect. It needed to be good enough that even hours of drift and correction still put the aircraft close enough to its target for a final visual lock to finish the job. And that distinction, tolerating imperfection rather than requiring precision the whole way, is what let a $50,000 aircraft survive a flight that would have broken a system built around GPS alone. Roughly 7 aircraft launched on the mission, low and slow, cruising at a pace that would have looked almost harmless on a radar screen built to hunt fighters and cruise missiles. Slow was not a weakness here. Slow, at this altitude, hugging terrain for hour after hour, was exactly what let them disappear into the kind of ground clutter that fast, high-flying threats never have to fly through. Each drone was built around little more than plywood and foam, a 2-cylinder piston engine turning a simple propeller, a design that traded every performance metric a traditional strike aircraft cares about for one thing that mattered more than all of them combined. It could fly a very long way for very little money, and Russia could afford to lose entire squadrons of interceptors trying to catch something worth a fraction of what any single interceptor cost. For the first several hours, the flight was almost uneventful, which was itself the plan working. Russian air defense radar did pick up contacts along the route, more than once, faint, slow returns crossing deep into Russian airspace at an altitude and a speed nothing dangerous was supposed to fly at. Somewhere near the Ural Mountains, the natural boundary most Russian planners had long treated as an informal edge between the war and the rest of the country. Part of the formation registered clearly enough on a regional radar screen that an operator flagged it directly. On more than one screen, an operator flagged the contact, ran the numbers on the reported behavior of the FP-1, and made the calculation that had been trained into every crew along that stretch of country. At this range, on this heading, a drone with a 1,600-kilometer ceiling simply could not still be flying by the time it reached the interior, let alone cross the Urals with hours of flight still ahead of it. It had to be something else. Weather return, bird activity, a misread track. The contact was noted and then, again and again, quietly dismissed, because the number everyone trusted said this particular threat should already be sitting empty on the ground somewhere far behind it. It never was. Every dismissed contact kept flying, drawing closer to Siberia with every hour that assumption went unchallenged. In a way, the drones were protected less by any stealth quality built into their design and more by the sheer stubbornness of the numbers sitting in every operator's head. A contact behaving impossibly, according to everything a crew had been trained to expect, is more likely to be written off as a sensor error than to trigger a reassessment of a range figure nobody had any reason yet to doubt. That is not a failure of any individual operator's judgment. It is what happens when an entire defense doctrine is built on an assumption nobody has been given a reason to question. And it is exactly the kind of gap this mission had been built from the start to exploit. By the time Russian command took the threat seriously enough to commit real assets against it, the drones had already crossed the deepest part of their route, and what came next showed just how poorly this country's most advanced systems were built for this specific kind of problem. Part of the difficulty was structural rather than technical. Siberia, unlike the western military districts bordering Ukraine directly, had never needed dense, layered, ground-based air defense coverage, because nothing had ever threatened to reach this far in. Batteries that would ordinarily backstop a slow-moving threat like this simply were not stationed out here in meaningful numbers, which meant Russian command had almost nothing local to throw at the problem and had to instead pull genuinely scarce, high-value assets away from wherever they were normally held in reserve. An A-50U airborne early warning aircraft, one of the most capable radar platforms Russia fields, was scrambled to help sort out exactly what was crossing its airspace and where it was actually headed. In theory, an aircraft like that solves this problem easily, looking down from altitude with a radar built to track exactly the kind of slow, low target that ground-based systems struggle against. In practice, an A-50U is built and trained to hunt fast movers, fighters, bombers, cruise missiles, threats that behave like threats. A slow-moving, low-flying aircraft built from wood and foam, flying a route deliberately chosen to blend into terrain clutter, does not present the kind of signature that platform's crews spend most of their training looking for. The A-50U got airborne. It did not meaningfully change the outcome. Russia sent up a Su-57 as well, one of its most advanced stealth fighters, an aircraft built for exactly the kind of high-value intercept this should have been, and it ran into the same fundamental mismatch. A fighter that fast, flying that high, is optimized to find and kill targets that move at speeds and altitudes nothing like a slow drone hugging the ground for hour after hour. Closing on a target that slow forces a fast interceptor into exactly the kind of low, careful flying it was never designed around, and finding a small, low-signature aircraft against cluttered terrain from a cockpit built for high-speed intercepts is a genuinely difficult problem no amount of raw performance advantage automatically solves. A machine built to win a fight in seconds at Mach 2 was being asked to solve a problem that unfolds over minutes at barely 100 kilometers an hour. Ground-based systems fared no better along the route, since the same lack of local coverage that made Siberia's skies feel safe left almost nothing to intercept anything that did get through. Some of the drones were lost along the way regardless, to jamming, to mechanical failure, to the sheer distance and duration involved in keeping a small piston engine running for the better part of a day. Not one confirmed loss came from either of Russia's most sophisticated assets successfully hunting one down before it reached its target. The most advanced tools in the country's arsenal had been sent to solve a problem they were never built to solve, and the aircraft they were chasing simply kept flying past them. 18 hours after the first engine turned over on a runway inside Ukraine, the surviving aircraft crossed into the airspace directly above the Omsk Refinery, and there the operation made one more decision that separated it from a purely destructive raid. The easy target sat right in front of them, massive fuel storage tanks, tens of thousands of tons of refined product sitting in the open, Exactly the kind of target that produces the dramatic fireball people expect from a strike video. The drones flew past them. Their real target sat deeper inside the facility, at the processing core rather than the storage yard. The ABT-10 and ABT-11 crude distillation units, the two sections of the refinery where raw crude actually gets separated into the fuels Russia depends on. A storage tank holds finished product that can be trucked in and replaced from elsewhere. A distillation unit is infrastructure, purpose-built industrial equipment that takes years, not weeks, to design, manufacture, and install. Destroy the tanks, and Russia loses fuel it can eventually replace. Destroy the distillation columns, and Russia loses the capacity to make more of that fuel in the first place, for as long as it takes to rebuild equipment that cannot simply be ordered off a shelf. The strike landed on exactly that target. Warheads tore into both distillation units, and fire spread through equipment that had spent the last several years running at close to full efficiency after a recent modernization program. Within hours, regional officials were confirming the fire publicly, unable to hide a blaze large enough to be visible for kilometers around a facility most of the country had assumed sat entirely beyond Ukraine's reach. By the time damage assessments circulated, the numbers made clear this was not a contained, easily patched incident. Roughly 3/4 of the refinery's total processing capacity was offline, and industry estimates for a full repair ran into many months rather than weeks, a timeline that reflects just how specialized the equipment inside a working distillation unit actually is. The damage went beyond a single burning refinery. Omsk was not simply one large facility among many. It was, by several industry estimates, responsible for something close to a tenth of all Russian oil refining capacity, and more than half of the fuel supply for the entire Siberian Federal District, a region with no easy alternative source sitting nearby. Knock a meaningful share of that processing offline, and the shortage does not stay contained to one refinery's balance sheet. It shows up in fuel prices and fuel availability across an entire region that had, until that morning, never had to think about this war reaching it directly. There was a second, quieter consequence that mattered just as much as the fire itself. Omsk was also one of Russia's key domestic producers of the specialized catalysts other refineries depend on to run their own cracking units, the process that turns heavier crude fractions into the lighter fuels vehicles and aircraft actually use. Lose the ability to produce those catalysts at scale, and there is no quick substitute sitting on a shelf somewhere else. Other refineries elsewhere in Russia, ones Ukrainian drones had never come close to reaching, suddenly found their own supply chains for a critical input running through a facility that could no longer reliably produce it at full capacity. For Russian air defense planning, the deeper problem this raid exposed had almost nothing to do with any single missed intercept. It was the number itself, the 1,600-kilometer assumption that had quietly defined an entire country's sense of what needed defending and what did not. An assumption like that does not just sit in one office. It shapes where air defense assets get deployed, which facilities get hardened, which regions get treated as safely out of range and therefore lower priority. When that assumption turns out to be wrong by more than a factor of 2, the failure is not a single radar operator making a bad call on one slow contact. It is every decision built on top of that number over the preceding months, all of it resting on a range figure that had already been quietly obsolete since a defense exhibition Russia's own analysts had watched and misjudged. There is a broader pattern sitting underneath this single strike, one that stretches well beyond Omsk. Over the preceding months, Ukraine had already worked its way through most of Russia's largest refineries one at a time, steadily eroding the country's fuel processing capacity, facility by facility. Before this strike, Omsk stood as one of the last major refineries still considered functionally out of reach, its distance alone treated as a form of protection no drone Ukraine was known to operate could threaten. Afterward, only a single major refinery in the entire country remained untouched, a facility sitting even farther east, protected for now by distance alone in exactly the way Omsk had been protected right up until it wasn't. That is the uncomfortable lesson sitting at the center of this operation. Distance has been one of the oldest, most reliable forms of defense in the history of warfare, The simple fact that an enemy's weapons cannot physically reach you. Cheap, long-range drones are quietly dismantling that assumption in a way expensive missile defense systems were never built to fully answer, because the threat they are being asked to stop no longer looks like the threat those systems were designed around. A $50,000 aircraft built from little more than wood, foam, and a small engine flew further into enemy territory than most cruise missiles are ever asked to travel, evaded some of the most sophisticated aircraft in that country's arsenal, and reached a target its planners had never seriously prepared to defend, because the number that told them how far it could fly had already stopped being true. The economics behind that fact are worth sitting with for a moment. A single advanced interceptor missile can cost more than an entire squadron of these drones combined, and even a modestly successful defense can end up costing far more than the raid itself, while the attacker only needs a handful of aircraft to get through to inflict damage that takes months to repair. That math does not favor the side doing the defending, and it gets worse with every strike a country has to absorb, because every refinery, depot, and airfield now has to be treated as a potential target regardless of how far it sits from any front line. Every refinery, depot, and factory Russia still considers safely out of range is sitting on the same kind of assumption Omsk did the night before this strike. Some of those assumptions are still accurate. The uncomfortable part is that nobody outside a very small circle in Ukraine currently knows which ones, and the only way the rest of the world tends to find out is after the fact, watching smoke rise over a facility that was supposed to be untouchable right up until it wasn't. What do you think? How many more of Russia's safe facilities are protected by nothing more than an outdated range estimate? Let us know in the comments